My mother-in-law turned my home upside down every time she visited. One day, I finally decided to. Have you ever been pushed so far, so consistently, by someone you're supposed to love, that you decide to expose them in the most undeniable way possible? What happened next blew up my entire family, and I have the footage to prove it. My mother-in-law, Diane, had a talent for leaving chaos in her wake every time she visited. It wasn't just messy, it felt deliberate. One day, I decided enough was enough. It was time for a wake-up call, and I had the perfect weapon. At a family dinner, with everyone gathered, I pressed play. The first clip flashed on the screen, just 4 seconds long. It showed Diane, alone in my kitchen, casually dipping 2 fingers into a smear of jam and dragging it across my pristine countertop like she was signing her name. The room went silent. You could feel the air thicken. Then, Mel, Aaron's sister, dropped her fork with a clatter. "Wait," she whispered, her eyes wide. "Is that Mom?" The next clip played, Diane at our mudroom door, looking down at her shoes, then purposefully grinding them into the flower bed before tracking mud across the floor I'd just mopped. Then, the third, a candy wrapper, not accidentally dropped, but tucked deep into a couch cushion, like she was hiding evidence, not just littering. By the fourth clip, the silence was chilling. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of stillness you get when people are watching something utterly shocking, struggling to process it. Because fully acknowledging what they were seeing meant admitting they'd either been blind to it for years, or worse, had actively ignored it. Diane's chair scraped back so violently it almost toppled. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, but her voice was off brittle. It cracked right in the middle. It was the sound of someone whose carefully constructed narrative had just been utterly demolished, with undeniable audio and video evidence. I paused the video on a still frame of her hand pressing cookie crumbs into my clean rug. My voice was level almost impossibly so, and it cost me everything I had. "I just have one question," I said, looking around the table. "Is Diane really just trying to help?" No one answered immediately. Then Aaron, my husband, said it. Just one word, flat and stunned. "No." And that word? You can't understand what it took for him to say that without knowing his story. Aaron grew up believing his mother was a saint. His dad left when he was 9, and Diane raised him alone, working 2 jobs, making sure he always had a warm coat, even if the electric bill was late. He carried this incredibly complicated gratitude for her his whole life. The kind of gratitude that makes grown men excuse behavior in their mothers they would never tolerate from anyone else. It's like a part of them is still that 9-year-old boy, terrified of being the reason she has one more thing to be tired about. That, honestly, was the red flag I'd missed for years. Not Diane's meanness, but Aaron's inability to see it, because in his mind, she could only ever be tired, or stressed, or doing her best. Never cruel, because a cruel parent would mean he wasn't safe, and a 9-year-old can't survive believing that about his only parent. Watching him say no out loud, in front of his entire family, was the moment I understood. We had both been protecting the same lie, just in different ways. I'd been protecting the peace. He'd been protecting the mother he needed her to be when he was 9. I thought about my own mother then, a 3rd-grade teacher for 31 years. I once described some of Diane's antics to her, like Diane lying on the phone that this house has a woman to clean it. My mom went quiet for a long moment before saying, "Sweetheart, that's not a joke. That's a job description she's handing you," without ever asking if you accepted the position. I hadn't fully understood it then, but standing in my own dining room, watching the footage prove her right in real time, it all clicked. Diane, being Diane, recovered fast. She always pivoted from shock to offense in seconds. "This has been edited," she declared, jabbing a finger at the pause screen. "You cut this together to make me look bad." "Edited into what?" Aaron said, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard directed at her before. Something flat, something final. "Your exact actions." "You trapped me," she shrieked, turning on me. "You put cameras in your own house like some kind of psycho." "In my own house," I corrected her, my voice rising slightly. "The same house where you've been making messes and insulting me for years." Then, Aunt Carol, a quiet woman who'd known Diane for 30 years, spoke up, firm but soft. Diane, I've defended you more than once to people who wondered why I put up with so much. Diane had no answer for Carol. She tried one more angle, the only honest sentence she'd utter all night. I was making a point. What point? I asked. That you act like this house is some kind of palace. That you think you're above ordinary messes? That a woman should know how to keep a home without complaining about it constantly. There it was. Not forgetfulness. Not stress. Punishment. Delivered one coffee spill, one hidden candy wrapper at a time. Because I hadn't performed womanhood the way she believed I owed her. I calmly told her she was welcome in our home only if she respected it. No unannounced visits, no insults, no leaving her messes for me. Erin told her she owed me an apology. Diane grabbed her purse, declared she'd never been so humiliated in her life, and stormed out. Nate, Erin's cousin, who I genuinely believe had never noticed a single one of Diane's behaviors in 15 years of family dinners because he was usually focused on whatever game was playing on TV, just sat there with his mouth slightly open. He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time as a whole person, not just Erin's wife, who cooks well. I always thought you were just really into cleaning, he said. It was so absurdly earnest that I actually laughed, the first real laugh I'd had in weeks. I had no idea any of that was happening on purpose, he added. Most people didn't, I told him. That was sort of the point of it. His uncle, Walter, a quiet man who rarely spoke at family gatherings, stood up before he left that night and shook my hand. It was an oddly formal gesture that struck me more than any of the louder reactions. That took nerve, he said, more than most people have. Sitting on years of that and never once losing your temper about it in front of the kids. I didn't know Walter well enough to gauge his praise, but it felt incredibly meaningful, and I held on to it. Nobody followed Diane. That silence, more than anything I'd said, told me I hadn't overreacted. I wish I could tell you the story ended there, tidy and satisfying, the way it might in a book where the truth simply comes out. It didn't. What came next was messier, and in some ways harder. Because exposing someone doesn't automatically make them stop. 3 days later, Mel called me. Her voice was tight. Mom's telling people you illegally spied on her. She even called Aunt Carol again, saying you could get in trouble. I'd expected this. I'd been waiting for it, like waiting for the second half of a storm after the eye passes over. I called an attorney, Patricia Solano, recommended by a friend. She specialized in family and civil law, the kind of domestic disputes that never make it to a courtroom, but absolutely deserve to be handled like they might. You installed the cameras in your own residence, Patricia told me, her tone brisk but not unkind. Our state is a one-party consent state for audio recording, meaning you only need your own consent to record a conversation you're party to, or that occurs in your own home. There's no reasonable expectation of privacy for a guest in someone else's living room or kitchen. Legally, you're on very solid ground. What she's describing as spying is functionally just a homeowner documenting activity in her own house. She's telling family I could get in trouble, I repeated. She's telling family that, Patricia explained, because it's the only leverage she has left. I'd recommend not engaging with that narrative directly. Let the footage speak. Trying to litigate gossip in a group chat rarely goes well for anyone. That advice was harder to follow than it sounded. 5 days after the dinner, Diane escalated again. This time, she claimed publicly to Carol, to a cousin, and eventually to a woman from her church prayer group that the footage had been doctored, spliced together from unrelated clips to make her look worse. This worried me more than the spying accusation. While she recorded me without permission could be seen through by any reasonable adult, the video was faked was the kind of claim that could actually spread and stick, especially among people who, on some level, wanted to believe the version of Diane they'd always been given. So, I did something I probably wouldn't have thought to do a year earlier. I hired a digital forensics examiner named Marcus Whitfield. 12 years in digital media authentication, the kind of specialist normally used in custody disputes or harassment cases where recordings are disputed. I sent him the raw, unedited camera files directly from the storage app, along with a short montage I'd shown at dinner. I asked him to confirm if the footage had been altered in any way. His report came back 4 days later, and I still remember the specific, clinical language of it because it was the first time in this whole ordeal that something Diane said got directly, measurably disproven, rather than just disbelieved. The submitted montage clips correspond exactly, frame for frame, to unedited segments of the original source files, Marcus wrote. Metadata timestamps are continuous and unaltered. There is no evidence of splicing, frame insertion, or manipulation of any kind. The montage represents a straightforward compilation of unmodified original recordings. I forwarded that report to Mel, to Carol, and at Aaron's insistence, directly to Diane herself, with a short note. I understand this is hard to accept. I had the footage independently authenticated, so nobody has to take my word for it. The church prayer group rumor reached its worst point about a week after the dinner. A woman named Sherry, whom I'd met only twice at holiday gatherings, sent Aaron a social media message. She suggested our family needed prayer for reconciliation and mentioned she'd heard some concerning things about surveillance in the home. Aaron showed it to me at the kitchen table, his jaw tight. "Do you want me to respond?" he asked. "No," I said. "Let's see if she asks Diane for a single specific detail." People spreading a story secondhand usually can't survive being asked to describe it directly. He didn't respond to Sherry. 2 weeks later, Carol mentioned that Sherry had asked Diane at a church function to explain exactly what the cameras had supposedly caught, and Diane had changed the subject twice before excusing herself to the restroom. The rumor died the way most rumors do when nobody's willing to actually defend the specifics out loud, quietly, from lack of oxygen, rather than from any dramatic confrontation. Diane didn't respond to the report. She responded 3 days later by trying a different door entirely. This is the part of the story that still makes my stomach tighten a little when I think about it, because it's the part where I learned that being exposed doesn't always make a person stop. Sometimes it just makes them quieter about the same behavior and more determined to find a way back in. Aaron came home from work on a Tuesday, about 2.5 weeks after the dinner, and found me standing in our kitchen. I was holding a grocery bag I hadn't unpacked yet, just staring at the counter. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Someone was here." I don't scare easily, and I want to be clear, I wasn't imagining things or catastrophizing. I'd left for the grocery store at 11 o'clock that morning with the kitchen exactly the way I always leave it. Dish towel folded over the oven handle, the kids' school folders stacked by the door for pickup later. When I came back at 12:40, the dish towel had been refolded badly. The kind of refolding someone does when they're trying to put something back the way they found it and don't quite remember how. A drawer that sticks. The one under the coffee maker was closed all the way, which it never fully does unless you know to lift the front edge slightly while pushing. Someone who knew this house. Someone who'd let themselves in. I checked the cameras. The living room and kitchen units, the ones facing the entryway and hallway, both had gaps in their recording. A device offline notice stamped across roughly 40 minutes of footage starting at 11:50 a.m. Not deleted, just paused. The kind of gap that happens when someone disconnects a camera from its home Wi-Fi network, deliberately waits, then reconnects it once they're gone. My hands went cold in a way they hadn't even during the dinner confrontation. Because there's a specific kind of fear that comes from an intruder you already suspect the identity of, walking calmly through your empty house while your kids' pickup time gets closer on the clock. I stood in that kitchen, doing an inventory of everything that felt slightly wrong, the way you check your own memory against a scene before you trust it. The bread box was turned so its opening faced the wall instead of the room, something I never do because it makes the bread harder to reach. A chair at the table had been pushed in flush against the edge, squared off with a precision none of us ever bothered with in a house with 2 kids constantly in motion. Small things. The kind of small things that mean nothing on their own, and everything together. "She still has a key," Aaron said. I watched something in his face go through several stages at once. Disbelief, then a kind of sick recognition, then something closer to fury than I'd ever seen from him. "I gave her one when Mom's arthritis got bad, for emergencies. I completely forgot she still had it. I had 26 minutes before I needed to leave for school pickup. And in that 26 minutes, I made 3 calls that changed the shape of the rest of the story. The first was to a locksmith, a man named Denny, who ran a small family business 2 towns over. He told me he could be at my house by 4 that afternoon to rekey every exterior lock. I get calls like this more than you'd think, he said, not unkindly, just matter of fact. The tone of a man who'd rekeyed enough homes after divorces and family disputes to have stopped being surprised by any of it. The second call was to Patricia, my attorney. She told me that while a spare key given years earlier technically complicated a straightforward trespassing claim, disabling security cameras before entering someone else's home without current permission was a meaningfully different situation than simply walking in unannounced, the way Diane always had before. I'd recommend documenting this incident formally, Patricia said. Not necessarily to pursue charges immediately, but to create a record. If this pattern continues after you rekey the locks, you want a paper trail showing you took it seriously from the first instance. The third call was to our local police non-emergency line. An officer named Ray Delgado, 19 years with the department, came out that evening once the kids were home and settled with Aaron in the living room. He walked the property with me, photographed the rekeyed locks Denny's had already installed, and took a full statement about the camera gap, the refold towel, the sticky drawer. I want to be straightforward with you, Officer Delgado said, sitting at my kitchen table with his notepad. Because there's no evidence of theft or property damage, and because she previously had lawful access via a key given to her by a resident of the home, this likely wouldn't rise to a criminal trespassing charge on its own, especially on a first documented instance. But I'm filing this as a formal incident report, and I want you to understand what that gives you. If it happens again, now that the locks are changed and she has no lawful basis for entry, that's a very different conversation. And this report becomes the first piece of a pattern. He gave me an incident report number before he left. 7 digits I wrote on a sticky note and put inside the same kitchen drawer where a recorder from an entirely different chapter of my life might have lived, if this had been someone else's story instead of mine. In this one, it was just the sticky note, small and official-looking, sitting next to takeout menus and spare batteries. A strange little artifact of how ordinary a genuine crisis can look once it's reduced to paperwork. The true peak of this crisis, if I'm honest, wasn't the moment I discovered the disturbed kitchen. It was the 20 minutes between finding it and reaching my kids at school, not knowing whether whoever had been in my house that morning had any interest in them at all. Running worst-case scenarios I won't fully describe here because some fears don't need to be written down to be understood. I made it to pick up 4 minutes early. Both kids were exactly where they were supposed to be, backpacks and complaints about homework fully intact. And I hugged them both a little longer than usual in the school parking lot, the kind of hug a kid tolerates without asking why. Aaron called his mother that night, the first time either of us had spoken to her directly since the dinner. I listened from the next room, not because I needed to supervise him, but because some conversations you just want to be near for, even silently. "Did you come to the house today?" he asked her. A long pause on her end, the kind I recognized now as her deciding which version of the story might still work. "I wanted to see my grandchildren," she finally said. "You've cut me off completely. What was I supposed to do?" "You could have called. You could have asked," Aaron said, his voice strained. "Instead, you let yourself in with a key I forgot you still had, and you disabled the cameras before you did it." "I didn't disable anything. I don't know how those things work," she insisted. "Mom," Aaron's voice cracked, not from sadness this time, but from something closer to disbelief that she was still, even now, choosing this. "The locksmith already rekeyed the house. There's a police report with your name in it. I need you to understand that whatever happens next, that happened because of choices you made today, not because anyone is trying to hurt you." She hung up on him. I heard it happen from the next room, the specific dead silence of a call that ends because one person refuses to keep hearing something. Aaron came and found me afterward, sat down heavily at the kitchen table, and put his face in his hands for a long moment before he spoke. "I keep waiting to feel like a bad son for any of this," he said. "The locks, the police report, all of it. I don't feel that way. I feel like I should have felt this way years ago, and I don't know what to do with that instead." "You don't have to know what to do with it tonight," I told him. "She let herself into a house with our kids' school folders sitting by the door," he said, and his voice had gone somewhere flat and far away. "I keep coming back to that. Not the towel, not the drawer. The folders. She was in a house where our children live, uninvited, with the cameras deliberately disabled first. I don't care how many birthday parties she planned or how many winters she covered the heating bill. That's not a mother having an off day. That's someone who needed to know she still had the power to walk in whenever she wanted. I didn't have anything to add to that. I just sat with him at the table until it got dark outside and neither of us had turned on a light. The two of us quietly recalibrating what we owed each other, now that we finally agreed on what we didn't owe her. For the next several weeks, nothing happened, which was its own kind of tension, the waiting for the other shoe kind. Mel, surprisingly, became one of the steadiest people in this entire story.
She called me twice that first week.
Once just to check in, and once to quietly tell me she'd found out from Carol that Diane had done something similar to Mel's own apartment years earlier, before Mel moved out at 20, rearranging things and making comments about how a young woman kept house, and that Mel had simply never had language for it before watching that footage at my dinner table. I thought it was just mom being mom, Mel told me. I didn't realize it was a pattern until I saw it laid out like that. That conversation mattered to me more than almost anything else in this whole ordeal, because it meant the footage hadn't just exposed Diane to a room full of relatives for one uncomfortable evening. It had given someone else, someone who'd lived under the same behavior for years without a name for it, permission to finally recognize what had actually happened to her. Mel called Diane herself about 2 weeks after that conversation with me. She told me about it afterward, sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee she'd made and cleaned up after entirely on her own, the kind of small detail I noticed more than I probably should have. I asked her point-blank if she remembered doing the same things at my old apartment, Mel said. The comments about my dishes, the way she used to straighten up my bathroom when she visited and leave it somehow messier than before. She said she didn't remember it that way. I told her I did, in detail, and that I finally believed my own memory of it instead of assuming I'd misunderstood her intentions. Diane hadn't apologized to Mel either, not really. But Mel said something shifted in the call anyway. The sound of a daughter refusing, for the first time, to hand her own memory over to someone else's more convenient version of events. Carol called me separately near the end of that same week, a conversation I hadn't expected at all. I want you to know I should have said something years ago, she told me. I saw things at family gatherings I chalked up to Diane just being particular. I think some of us protected her reputation longer than we protected you. And I'm sorry for the part one played in that. I didn't know what to say to that at first, because it was the first time anyone in Erin's extended family had acknowledged out loud that the years of tolerating Diane's behavior hadn't been neutral. Silence had been a choice, too, and it had cost me something every single time it was made. Erin and I started seeing a family therapist together about a month after the police report. A woman named Dr. Renata Kessler, 18 years in practice, specializing in adult children navigating difficult parental relationships. I went in expecting the sessions to be mostly about Diane. They ended up being mostly about Erin, about the 9-year-old inside him who still flinched at the idea of fully, permanently disappointing his mother, and about how loving someone honestly sometimes means finally being willing to disappoint them. You're not responsible for managing your mother's feelings about consequences she created herself, Dr. Kessler told him in a session I sat in on near the end of that first month. You're responsible for protecting your own family. Those aren't in conflict nearly as often as guilt tells people they are. Diane went quiet for 6 weeks after the phone call that ended in a hang-up. No visits, no calls, no messages relayed through Carol or Mel. I won't pretend that silence didn't feel strange, even lonely, in a way I hadn't expected. The specific unease of a conflict that simply stops rather than resolves. Then, on a Thursday evening in early spring, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I hadn't heard from in 6 weeks. I should not have disrespected your home. I was wrong. It read. I read it 3 times before I showed it to Erin. For her, he said, staring at his phone like it might explain itself further. That's basically the equivalent of climbing Mount Everest. I didn't respond right away. I sat with it, the way I'd learned over these last 2 months to sit with things instead of reacting to them the moment they landed. 2 days later, I wrote back that she was welcome to visit the following Sunday between 2 and 4, and that I'd appreciate her calling ahead from now on. She arrived at 2:05. She took her shoes off at the door unprompted. When she made herself tea, she carried her own cup to the sink afterward. When a cracker crumb landed on the counter, she swept it into her palm and walked it to the trash herself. And I watched her do it, and I understood that I was watching someone perform a version of respect she'd never once shown me voluntarily before a 15-minute video montage, and a police incident report had made the cost of not respecting it too expensive to keep paying. I don't think Diane is a different person now. I don't think 15 minutes of footage and a rekeyed lock rewrites 40 years of a person's habits, or the specific comfort she'd always taken in believing a woman who kept a clean, ordinary home somehow owed her family for the privilege of being allowed to enjoy it. I think she's a person who finally understood, in a language she couldn't argue her way around, that there were real, specific, escalating consequences attached to behavior she'd spent years treating as consequence-free. Dr. Kessler told us once that insight and change aren't the same thing. That plenty of people learn exactly what they did wrong without ever fully believing it was wrong, and simply adjust their behavior to avoid the penalty rather than to honor the person they hurt. I think that's probably closer to the truth of where Diane landed than any tidier version I could tell you. But here's what I know for certain. Sitting in my kitchen now, mud-free, cough-earring-free, 6 months out from the night I pressed play on that laptop in front of her entire family, I am not the difficult one. I was never the dramatic one, or the controlling one, or the woman who thought too highly of her own flaws. I was simply the one who finally had proof of something everyone around me had spent years asking me to prove, without believing it could exist. I still have the footage. I still have Marcus Whitfield's authentication report, Officer Delgado's incident number, Patricia's file notes, all of it sitting quietly in a folder I hope I never need to open again. I keep it anyway. Not because I'm waiting for her to slip, but because some lessons only stay learned as long as both people remember exactly what it costs to teach them. Aaron and I talk sometimes about what we'll tell our kids about all of this when they're older. Whenever the day comes that they ask why Grandma Diane's visits changed shape so abruptly this spring, they were 8 and 11. I don't think we'll tell them everything. Not the spare key, not the police report, not the 6 weeks of silence that felt heavier than any of the shouting ever had. But I think we'll tell them the part that matters most, the part one want them to actually carry into their own adult lives someday. Being family isn't a blank check against basic respect. Love doesn't require you to absorb disrespect quietly just because the person doing it shares your blood, or raised the person you married, or brought a casserole dish to make the invasion look like generosity. You're allowed to require decency from the people who are supposed to love you, even when they've spent years teaching you that requiring it makes you the difficult one. I didn't set 3 cameras in my kitchen because I wanted a war with my mother-in-law. I set them because I was tired of being told, gently and repeatedly, that my own eyes couldn't be trusted about what was happening in my own home.